All right, so now we're going to finish up the major next portion of When the Night Comes Falling by Howard Blum, and we're going to get into the drug issue. And this is one of those issues that I have been relatively hesitant to get on board with, even though I know that the drug issue in this potential murder case in Idaho is a thing. So let me talk a little bit about, while I clean my glasses, why I have been a little bit hesitant on the drug thing. First of all, one of my first introduction to the drug story, if you will, was Pavarotti or J. Embry's videos that people were telling me about, in which a lot of the focus was on methamphetamine. And one of the things that I was pointing out is there was two things that were kind of bugging me at the back of my mind on the whole narrative of Bryan Kohberger was into drugs, and that's what happened in this house. And one, that Bryan Kohberger's drug of choice back in the day was heroin, and it's in the opposite end of the spectrum as fentanyl. I mean, not fentanyl, of the opposite end of the spectrum as meth. So heroin being a major depressive and meth being a major upper. It seemed to be that I, as a non-drug person, viewed that what I know about people who are on drugs, they have a preference for certain types of highs. So the high of, for example, meth is the opposite direction of a heroin user. So somebody who likes depressants, and that does for them, that treat, because a lot of times in drugs, it seems like you're medicating some issue that you have, something that you have a problem relating with. And so drug use becomes a way to medicate those things. A lot of times that's all people really are doing who are drug users. They're basically doing a non-official medical route of pharmaceutical companies and trying to medicate their issues in a different way. That's my psychology behind a lot of drug use is medicating traumas, and there's a preference of the type of high. So again, I felt at the beginning that it was a little stereotypical to say that because Bryan Kohberger had a history of drugs in the past, that means he's a drug user, and therefore if there's any drugs anywhere near this story, that Bryan Kohberger must have been on drugs, because again, drug users must be into drugs. So therefore, if there's drugs in the area, a former drug addict has to be back into drugs again. And I have two problems with that fundamentally. That just because Bryan Kohberger had a history of drugs, that means he's a drug user for life. I'm not the kind of person personally who subscribes to the idea once an addict, always an addict. I know that's the mentality, and I know people will beat the shit out of me. We've had this argument. I have friends who are addicts, so we argue all the time about the mentality that NA has, that once you're an addict, you're always an addict, and you're always just 1 second away from having a needle broken off in your arm and being in the gutter if you even take a sip of alcohol. That whole logic of telling yourself you're an addict, once you're an addict, you're always an addict, is something that I a little bit have a problem with. But that's coming from a non-addict, so be gentle when you beat the shit out of me and tell me you know nothing about drug addiction, because I get it. People who have drug addiction problems tell me I'm an asshole because, yes, once an addict, always an addict. But the point being is that I have a reason to feel that Bryan Kohberger kicked his addiction, and that he was no longer an addict, and that he had done well in school. He had cleaned up his problems. He'd become fit. He got his mind sharp. He got his body sharp. He was focused on the path, and he was a PhD candidate, for fuck's sake. So he was in the PhD program. So the guy, I feel like, would have a real hard time, in my opinion, being a meth addict and going to school. Now, some of you have argued again, devil's advocates, you have no idea about drugs. Doing meth is something you could totally do well in school on. It keeps you up more hours, blah, 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 blah. Again, I'm just letting you know why I have been hesitant to get into the drug thing. And again, it's mostly because I tend to believe that people seek a similar high. So heroin and meth are on opposite ends of the spectrum. But in comes again the story of Emma Bailey and Demetrius. These individuals have been talked about a lot. I don't talk about them a lot, but I have heard the names for forever, and I've got my own feelings about the possibility of their involvement. But in the chapters, the last two chapters of this section, and we'll just take a look real quick at this on screen. So we're dealing with that's part 5, the defense's story. We're reading 31 and 32. So we're ending part 5, the defense's story, on the drug connection. And this is it. 2 chapters are going to be on the drugs. And so we're going to talk about the drugs now and the drug angle and my feelings of the drug angle. And I want to say, again, caveat right up front. A lot of you aren't going to feel that I'm qualified. I'm not qualified to talk about drugs. I don't have a big history with drugs. And so maybe I'm not qualified to talk about drugs and drug addiction and how that world works. I'm just giving you my opinions. So if it's one area that you're going to probably have the biggest problem with me, if you follow my channel, is maybe my opinions about the drug, because a lot of you are following the big creators who are convinced this is a drug house and a drug hit and all those things. And I will give it credence. I will tell you where I think it does match up. I will point out where I think it does match up or it has a potential in these two chapters. So let's get into the drug history and those things, and I'll explain that as we go. So now we're talking about, it feels like I didn't highlight, anyways, yes, I guess it did. So here's I'm going to start with this, it's in the middle of a sentence. 3 of the victims' parents, Kernodle's mom, Mogan's stepmom, and Mogan's dad, had been arrested on felony drug possession charges. And even Steve Gonzalez could be tarred by a similarly damning brush. His brother Nathan was serving time in jail for a drug-related murder. So we have we have 3 of the 4 victims in the house who have family members involved in drugs, including Steve Gonzalez / Kaylee's family peripherally involved in drugs. So one would be remiss not to suggest the possibility that drugs are involved. I get it. And I'm not saying it's not. But let's continue on and we'll break this down. Ann Taylor, Kohberger's lead legal aid attorney, had been aware of at least some of this history. She had been representing Kara Knodel before promptly petitioning the court to be removed when offered the bigger challenge of representing the man accused of murdering Knodel's daughter. In the aftermath, sharp words had been exchanged in the press. Knodel charged that she had been betrayed. Taylor shot back that she had simply been assigned the case and had never met Knodel. So this was one of the big things in the very, very early parts of this stage, before I was a true crime channel on YouTube, before I was really covering it other than just interested in with my friends and talking about it. I thought to myself, how is Ann Taylor allowed to represent Brian Kohberger when she previously had represented one of the victim's family members in a drug-related case? It seemed like a clear conflict of interest. The answer at the time was that being that Ann Taylor was the public defender and was therefore the head of the department, her name got put on every single person that came through at some point and then would be reassigned to someone else. So Kara Knodel, according to the story that I heard in the early stages, was that Ann Taylor was never really Kara Knodel's attorney. She was just on paperwork because she was the defender's office and basically got assigned the case for a moment, and she never had met Kara Knodel. So that therein led the why it's not a conflict of interest, because the murder case come up with Brian Kohberger. Ann Taylor had not actually represented Kara Knodel, had not actually met Kara Knodel yet. Her name was just on paperwork. The confusion was further exasperated by Kara seeing Ann Taylor's name on it and seeing that she'd been reassigned somebody else. So then she got pissed, thinking that she just lost her attorney. The argument is Ann Taylor was never Kara's attorney. That's the argument. Now, I never dug much deeper into it. I accepted that thing. I don't know that there's something there, but if you go too far down the drug rabbit hole, maybe you need to return to that. It's always in the back of my mind. All right. 4 victims and 3 parents and 1 uncle with a history of drug arrests. What are the odds? Is that a coincidence, a sad commentary on contemporary American life, or something more telling, even a clue? So I also believe in the idea that this is not just a coincidence. So when you start having that many people in the house who are related to drug-related offenses, we must pay attention, and I will pay attention in these 2 chapters. Now we're going to talk about a particular person who drug overdosed, Caden Young, and how he died twice in the same night. Was it the same? Yeah, in a single night. So that, of course, intrigues you. How does a person die twice in a single night? Now, the details of the case aren't super important other than the links to the drug cartels. So we'll break this down. A former University of Idaho frat president, a 22-year-old journalism major in his junior year, died not once but twice in a single night. So here we go. A person with drugs at the University of Idaho, not happening at Idaho, but a former University of Idaho student. And in the aftermath of his tragic and needless demise, new avenues of speculation multiplied, spreading out in previously unexplored directions. Caden Young was looking to score. He succeeded only to pay with his life. That was the thumbnail history of events as detailed in the initial terse news stories. But anyone taking the time to go through the voluminous pile of police reports or conversing with either the detective who had caught the case or equally elucidating the legal aid lawyer who subsequently became involved would latch on to a richer account. I should be looking over here because there's no reason I have to do that over here. All right. And one that added 2 new actors to the drama. They were a couple. So this is 2 new actors added to the drama of this story. A couple who caught the Kohberger's defense team's rapt attention. In will come very, very quickly, Emma Bailey and Demetrius. So we're going to talk about those here. Demetrius Robinson. Young, with a matter-of-factness that left his friend astonished, recounted that he had been partying that afternoon with friends in a room at a Seattle Holiday Inn and had snorted lines of cocaine, apparently laced with fentanyl. Within moments, his face went white, then blue, and suddenly everything turned completely black. I was dead, bro. This was the first time he died. Legally died, according to this story, when he snorted cocaine laced with fentanyl. All right. Back at O'Flaherty's apartment, so his friend O'Flaherty picked up Young, took him back to his place, and back at O'Flaherty's apartment, Young promptly crashed on the futon. He was nodding out in the back of the car. It said this was after he had his death, if you will, and got basically brought back to life with the aid of narcotic stimulants to bring him back. He's back at the apartment. He was nodding off. And now he's snoring something awful. O'Flaherty playfully recorded the racket on his phone. He thought that he'd have a good laugh over it in the morning, but when he checked his friend a bit later, there was a swirl of whitish vomit circling Caden's mouth, and a frantic search for a pulse revealed nothing. When the medics arrived, it became official. Caden had suffered a second and final death. It was all too common. Another young life ravaged by fentanyl. And within days, it might very well have become another dreadful statistic in a national body count that was climbing towards pandemic proportions. But then the police made 2 arrests in connection with Young's death. Now, here we go. Shit starts to get a little bit more interesting. The police arrested Emma Bailey, 22, of Moscow, and Demetrius Robinson, 36, of Tacoma, just as the couple were about to leave. Now, right off the bat, let me tell you something again. My uneducated, you're not qualified to talk about drugs, Mr. Devil's Advocate. Fentanyl does have, in my opinion, that high like heroin. They're both sedative type highs. So now I'm intrigued as I was, when I was looking into the Emma story. Fentanyl makes a lot more sense of being a appealing drug to a former heroin addict than methamphetamine. Again, opposite ends of the spectrum. So fentanyl is a huge thing. And I've got tons of shit to say about fentanyl, but we're going to table that shit because it's more of the conspiracy theory shit about fucking taking over the poppy fields in Afghanistan and the U.S. government smuggling fentanyl into the United States. That's a whole nother shitstorm. But the point being is that fentanyl intrigues my mind more as a possibility of a drug of choice for a former addict who was into heroin, because again, they're both very heavy depressives in my limited view of those drugs. Now, the pair, we're talking about Emma Bailey and Demetrius Robinson, spent 2 months and 5 days behind bars, and during that time, law enforcement investigators and the press kept digging. And what they unearthed grabbed the attention of the Koberger's legal defense team. Robinson, or D, as he was widely known in the college towns of both Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington, had a dismaying rap sheet. Extensive was the adjective the local paper used to describe it. Violent was the modifier, though that leaped up in the minds of the legal investigators. Now, so D appears to be, Demetrius Robinson, appears to be a heavy-handed enforcer type guy who makes sure people pay up when they're buying drugs. So this is a violent individual with a big rap sheet living near the murder scene, along with Emma Bailey, who may have been dealing fentanyl. So all of these things do have to be in the back of your mind. Were these drug dealers within very, very short distance of the house? Was there a drug connection? And did somebody like Robinson or Demetrius, who has a very violent history and is described in this chapter as being basically an enforcer, did that come into play? He's the kind of person who's violent, who's been accused of rape and physical violence against people. So a violent individual living nearby and a drug history and fentanyl. Now the question becomes, is Koberger related to the fentanyl thing? Did he, when he got into Pullman, hook up with the fentanyl crowd looking for some kind of downer like he had before with the heroin addiction? Again, I have a hard time personally going too far down that rabbit hole considering his academic prowess. I'm not sure that a heavy sedative like fentanyl or heroin does well when you're in college as well. But that's just me. Again, a lot of people say you're a moron, devil's advocates. People in colleges are doing drugs left and right. And that's probably very, very true. I'm just saying that I'm not going heavy into the drug thing and haven't. And I'm telling you why I have a little bit of reservation on it. All right. Among the eyebrow-raising highlights, this is of D's history, a 15-month prison sentence, 15-month prison sentence for second-degree assault in Pullman in 2018, a second-degree rape investigation 2 years earlier, and then in 2001, an arrest in Pullman for suspicion of possession of a controlled substance with intent to deliver for allegedly assaulting a companion when their alleged partnership went south. So D has a history of violence, right? Second degree assault that lasts him over a year in jail, rape allegation. It doesn't look like that stuck, but that was an investigation into a rape. Some other kind of assault involving somebody he's a business partner with. So yes, violent individual, into drugs, into fentanyl, along with Emma. Bailey's mother, now she's going to recall an encounter that Bailey had. Emma Bailey had an encounter with police officers on a body cam when she was inebriated. And Bailey's mother is giving a more contemplative story about her daughter in 2 lengthy telephone conversations that were recorded by the Centralia detectives investigating the sale of lethal fentanyl-laced cocaine. So this was the lethal fentanyl-laced cocaine that killed Caden Young. Police are looking into this thing. Emma Bailey has some interviews with investigators in that death, that fentanyl-laced death of Caden Young. As the mother shared the tale, her daughter was an innocent Moscow High graduate who had put in a disjointed year at the University of Idaho before hooking up with Robinson, 14 years her senior. 14 years her senior. Charmer with his cornrows and tough guy menace. And what a tumultuous 5-year love story their romance had been. Bailey, her mother said, had allegedly been living in fear of Robinson's violent mood swings and hair-raising threats that would happen to her of what would happen to her family if she ever left him. So again, here's a guy who's extremely violent. This woman's attracted to him because of his violence, apparently, in part, his tough guy menace. And he's threatening to do shit like kill her family if she ever leaves him. That kind of person has to raise your hackles on whether somebody who's threatening to kill someone. Now, this doesn't say he threatened to kill her family, but it says by hair-raising threats of what would happen to her family if she ever left him. So Dee had apparently threatened her family in some way. Probably death threats, maybe just beating the shit out of him. I don't know. But whatever the case is, the guy's violent and he threatens to take out families. So now you have to ask yourself, could this individual take out a house of people if he's pissed at somebody? Put that on the back burner. There had been times, in fact, when Kimberly and her ex-husband had rushed to their daughter's rescue after getting a teary distress call. They'd drive for hours and then covertly ferry Emma off while Robinson was sleeping the afternoon away. But each time, Bailey would run back to Robinson. So she's been afraid of Robinson. It's a love-hate relationship, like so many are, unfortunately. They'd rescue her, she'd go back. They'd rescue her, she'd go back. And there was more. When the cops dug deeper, they grew to suspect that the couple were very possibly dealing drugs that they'd scored in Seattle to the local colleges of Pullman and Moscow. So here we go. Law enforcement became suspicious that Emma and Demetrius were drug dealers running drugs in Pullman and Moscow. Would make sense. The detective's incident report flatly stated there were investigations in other jurisdictions for Emma and Demetrius for narcotics trafficking. O'Flaherty told cops that he'd first met Bailey when she'd come to Alpha Lambda Kappa parties to see if brothers were interested in scoring some coke. So, according to this person, Emma would go to Greek life, go to Greek areas. You know, like all the girls were in sororities. Ethan was in a frat. Emma would go to the frats. She would go to the sororities, and she would peddle drugs. She would go look for people who wanted to buy some coke. He soon learned firsthand, however, that she was merely the engaging go-between. Robinson was the iron-fisted closer. So Robinson, Demetrius, seems to be the drug dealer. Emma is the one that's the recruiter. She goes out and she finds people who want to buy drugs from D. That's the story that we're getting told here. So then she said, and then Robinson was the iron-fisted closer. He'd hand over the product and give you a look that made sure that you paid. So he's a big, intimidating dude that threatens violence if you don't pay up. If something goes wrong with a violent person who is an enforcer and an iron-willed guy who threatens to take out people or whatever, do physical damage, that kind of person is someone you don't mess with. Did something go wrong in the house on Idaho 4 where somebody wronged Demetrius? And did Demetrius, as a violent individual, have anything to do with the 4 girls that got killed? And if so, does it relate to Brian Kohberger in any way, shape, or form? These are the questions that we're forming as we read through this chapter. Talk to students and ex-students in Moscow, Pullman, who knew Bailey and Robinson, and the response was a uniform chorus. The couple did a lively business dealing drugs along Greek Row. So again, it's been stated a million times, I've known about it as well, that there were allegedly drug dealers, Emma and Dee in particular, living right next door, very, very close, not right next door, but very, very close to the King Road house. Within, there's a walkway, as infamously I've seen on the internet. I think Pavarotti did this great video showing the little path. I think it was him that showed the path. It was a walkway that you could walk up between those to get to their houses. Very close, very connected. Even if the streets don't look like they line up, there's a walkway that connects them very easy. Now, the worst thing you can say that Dee has is an anger management problem, but Dee is getting it under control, someone says. It's a real love story, he went on with for us, where Dee goes, Emma goes. So Dee's got an anger management problem, but he's working on his anger. So he's a violent individual with anger management issues. If something goes wrong and something pisses him off, how much rage comes out of Dee? That's the question we have to ask. Just 5 days before the trial for supplying lethal cocaine was to begin. So this is back at Caden Young's thing. They're Emma and Demetrius going on trial for Caden Young's death with fentanyl-laced cocaine. Just 5 days before trial for supplying lethal cocaine was to begin, a judge dismissed the case. Their legal aid lawyer had zeroed in on a technicality, but it was a very consequential one. The question of prosecutorial jurisdiction. Apparently, they'd been scheduled to be tried in the county where the death had occurred rather than where the cocaine had been originally ingested. So that's the problem. The drugs were taken in one county, then the individual left that county and died in another county, and they were trying it in the wrong jurisdiction. They should have been trying it where the drugs were taken or ingested rather than where the person eventually died. So that turned into a technicality, and that left some problems with that prosecution. So the last chapter on the drug thing, last chapter on the defense's story, and then we get to Steve Gonzalez's story and the epilogue, and we're done with this book. The defense investigators' first stop was the Seattle DEA field office, and the overview that they offered was, by all accounts, a tale of cutthroat international intrigue. It was the story of a pipeline that ran from China, where the fentanyl precursor chemicals were produced, to the sinister Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels in Mexico, which manufactured the drugs and then were smuggled to the too often lethal product to their distribution networks in the northwestern urban hubs such as Seattle and Spokane. Next, with the eager help of freelance army of small-time distributors, the drugs reached into seemingly wholesome all-American counties and colleges like Moscow, Idaho. So the drugs come through Mexico, from China into Mexico, up Mexico, Seattle area. From Seattle, then they go to small-time dealers off into the small towns, like college towns, like Moscow and Idaho and Pullman, Washington. Makes complete sense. And it does then lead us into drug cartels and all those other things. So while some people think it sounds completely off the hook, crazy conspiracy theory to think it's a drug cartel hit, there's a circuitous route in which drugs are coming into the U.S. and flowing to college towns that involves cartels. Now, whether the cartel itself reached that far down into the low-level drug dealers or not is a whole nother thing. It seems like Emma and Demetrius, according to the story, go and get their drugs in the Seattle area and then come back and push it into the colleges. And so they're kind of the go-between between the cartels and not any kind of direct cartel thing. Sheriff Brett Myers, head of the Quad City Drug Task Force, a multi-jurisdictional team propped up in part by federal money. So this is important. This talks about that drug task force. This is where it starts to get super interesting. Follow the money is something I always say. So Sheriff Brett Myers, head of the Quad City Drug Task Force, a multi-jurisdictional team propped up in part by federal money, whose territory included university towns of Moscow and Pullman. So we got a drug task force running in the area. These are, again, things that I'm not hearing this for the first time in this book. I've known about the drug task force. I've known about the drug connection. I just have been hesitant to jump down the drug trail for some reason. I follow my gut instincts in cases, and my gut instinct hasn't been to go too far, too fast with this. So it's something that we can't ignore. It's there, and people have asked me all the time, what about Emma? What about Emma? What about Demetrius? We're covering it now and I'm trying to explain as best as I can why I'm a little hesitant to go too far with it. Anyways, so the drug task force includes Idaho and Moscow, Idaho, Pullman, Washington. It was enough to give anyone whose child was heading off to college in the area the willies. I got to kill never mind. I was going to kill something that made a little ding on my computer, but I guess we're just going to stay with it. Okay. The sheriff shared that his task force was working with college kids. So the drug task force works with college kids in the local schools whom they caught dealing MDMA and cocaine. So that's ecstasy, MDMA, ecstasy, which would be popular in college campuses, I'm sure, and cocaine, flipping them and using the students to go after big local dealers. So again, this book is documenting that a sheriff is reporting there is a drug task force in the towns, a multi-jurisdictional drug task force that works with college students to go after big drug dealers. So all those theories that you hear out there have to be taken very, very seriously, because many people are asking, is part of the reason why it seems like there's police corruption in this case, or there's indications that the police are trying to turn a blind eye or move you in a different direction, is because they don't want to uncover confidential informants who work with the drug task force, college students who work with the drug task force to bust big drug dealers. And furthermore, let's not overlook the fact that there's a financial incentive to not let the word get out that your college campuses of Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington have a drug problem. Who wants to send their kids to a college that's rife with drugs? So the drug task force has incentives to keep it on the download and go after and break up the big drug dealers to try to make it a non-issue before the schools are impacted by losing students, because nobody wants to send their students to a drug-infested area. So everything's kept on the down low. They employ college students to go after the drug dealers, and you can start to see how there could be a rife situation of police misconduct, law enforcement misconduct, to hide their trail on what they know and who's confidential informants. All of those things that I say are lower on my priority list are very, very, very worthy of paying attention to. And as the trial goes into the real trial, when I go into the courtroom and attend this trial, I wonder how much of the drug angle is going to come out, and it'll change my mind. I'll report on it heavily if that's where this goes. Anyways, so and once the scared, witless college kids had helped his team ID the foot soldiers, we go up the ladder to get the people tied to the cartels in the cities. So again, the drug task force uses college kids, puts pressure on them to work with law enforcement, doesn't really give a shit what happens to the kids when they piss off cartels, but they use the kids to go after the mid-level drug dealers, and then trace the mid-level drug dealers back to the cartels, working up the chain, back to Seattle, back to Mexico, back to China, all that shit. Could it have been a drug-related case? I can't rule it out. It's not improbable. From what I know, that'd answer a lot of questions. This is the sheriff commenting on whether or not that house was a drug hit related to this whole investigation with drugs. Did any of the victims know Emma Bailey and Demetrius Robinson? Had the couple from time to time joined the throng of kids who regularly flocked to the King Road house? Totally plausible. If you've got a drug dealer within walking distance of your house, and that's a party house, even if the girls involved in the murder weren't themselves users of the drug, even if they weren't, and I don't think it's been ruled out that that none of the girls had any drug issues, but even if they weren't, people going to a party house within walking distance of a drug dealer or alleged drug dealer probably had people that come and go from that house on a regular basis that were involved in drugs. Those now became the game-changing questions the investigators for the defense had been trying to answer. Now we get to Ashlyn Couch. Ashlyn Couch, the roommate who signed the lease but then didn't live there. Ashlyn Couch, who has recently had her mother on Dateline NBC tearfully saying how Ashlyn was supposed to be there that night and almost died. I riffed on that enough, so let's just put that aside. Ashlyn Couch had been one of the original signers of the lease on the King Road house with the others, but she had never moved in. Nevertheless, she remained a friend, as well as a sorority sister of several of the residents, and according to some reports, she would visit from time to time. She even celebrated her 21st birthday with a spirited party at King Road. And Couch followed Bailey on Instagram, which could mean something or nothing, but it did lead the defense team in another to even more pertinent questions. Did Bailey know Kohberger? So Ashlyn Couch, who didn't even live in the house, but she did hang out with the girls and she did come back to the house from time to time. She likes Emma Bailey on Instagram. Does that mean that there's a drug connection to the house? That's very, very light ties. But then it led to the question, did Emma Bailey know Brian Kohberger? All right. What if Emma Bailey had been at the pool party? Again, now we're trying to look for a connection. We're trying to force a connection. But let's see how it goes. If she had been, then she might very well have been approached by a Kohberger on the make, same as two young women in the black bikinis that we'd heard about Brian Kohberger hitting on some girls at the party. So if Emma was at the pool party that Brian Kohberger first went to when he got into town, and if Kohberger had been approached like he approached other females with no evidence to show that, but if Emma was there and if he approached her, did Kohberger make an instant connection with a drug dealer, and would fentanyl have been, or cocaine laced fentanyl, been more his liking than methamphetamine? And again, in my limited experience, I would say fentanyl would have more of an appeal to a former heroin addict than meth, but that's just me. And I keep adding that because I'm just giving my opinions. And again, I feel like a lot of you are going to be like, you really shouldn't be talking about the drug situation for what it is. All right. Now, and if, as the police allege, she was in the habit of dealing recreational drugs, it might have been a connection a one-time heroin addict like Kohberger would have relished. Okay. Okay. In fact, he might have even, I feel like this is the whole prosecution case. He might have run into the girls at a restaurant one time, and he might have hit on one of the girls, and she might have rebuffed him, which might have led him to decide that he's going to kill her because he might love beautiful things, but he can't have, and he might not be able to get laid. So maybe that's why Brian Kohberger did what he did, because all these things might have happened. I feel like that's kind of almost the same thing we're going. He might have met Emma Bailey at the party, and if he did, he might have been offered drugs, and if he did, he might have taken her up on it, and therefore he might be back into drugs again because he just happened to run across the drug dealer in town at the party. Again, why treat this a little with kid gloves? It needs to be stronger for me than he might have with no proof that he did, or no real, even strong evidence that he did. I don't feel like the evidence is strong. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I need to watch a lot more videos out there, because I just don't feel the strong connection. I hear a lot of might, which is what I felt like every time I hear this story. Which might and could, all these words, might, could have, who knows, might, which could put it very much within the same incriminating cell tower radius. So, okay, let me back up. I think I missed part of the sentence. In fact, Brian Kohberger might have visited Bailey from time to time at her home in Moscow, which, as it happened, was tucked into the very end cul-de-sac, a minute or so drive away from the murder house. Again, what's misstated here about the minute or so drive is, yes, if you take roads, it might be a minute or so to get over from one house to the other, but there's a walkway that goes between the two, which makes it a much more direct route. But anyways, which would put it very much within the same incriminating cell tower radius as the scene at the King Road. So on King Road. So again, the question becomes, was Brian Kohberger's car indeed in the area, but was it perhaps in the area because Brian Kohberger has a fentanyl addiction or a drug addiction of some kind and is going to see his drug dealer on a regular basis? And again, to me, I'm gonna say it one more time. It's so weak. Might have, could have, should have, maybe he got back into drugs, maybe he pissed away all the hard gains that he made with whatever, and maybe he was back into drugs, and maybe that's true. Maybe it is true. But there's a lot of maybes. Evidence corroborating Mr. Kohberger being at a location other than the King Road address will be disclosed, Ann Taylor wrote in a court filing. Yet with the dramatist flair, she held on to the punchline. She did not reveal any further details. Presumably, all will be disclosed at the trial. So early on, it appears, Ann Taylor said, there may be reasons why Brian Kohberger was in the area of the house. And by area, we don't even know if she's conceding it means real near the house or just pinging off the cell tower that services the residents, or pinging off the cell tower that is within reach of a tower that services. Anyways, the wording gets more and more sketchy the more you look into the wording on it. But is Ann Taylor indicating that maybe Brian Kohberger had a reason to go near the house because his drug dealer was there? Are they gonna say that Brian Kohberger was into drugs and that he was going to Emma's house? I don't know. 7 people who were queried about Brian Koberger meeting Emma Bailey at the party, and that people, so the investigators were looking into, according to this, were looking into whether or not Emma Bailey was at that party, at the pool party that Brian Koberger was at early on. 7 people who were queried, and the responses all shared, and after a good deal of thought, ran a narrow gamut from "I think she was there" to "she might have been." So 7 people came up with a story that Emma may have been at the party. Not sure, she might have been. I think she was there. No, nothing definitive. No pictures, no proof, but people think she might have been. But no one said she definitively was there, or definitely was there. And no one said she definitely wasn't. In short, there remained enough for the defense to offer a hypothetical alternative to the version of events that will be rolled out by the prosecution. I highly doubt Ann Taylor's defense is that in a hypothetical world, Emma might have been at the party, and Brian Koberger might have met her, and Brian Koberger might have been into drugs and might have gotten back into drugs, and therefore it might have been his drug dealer, and that might be why he was there. And I doubt that's where she's going, but that's what it sounds like we're trying to believe. Yet these speculations, like everything in this case seems to be a speculation, when held up to light, immediately turned porous. There was never any drug paraphernalia found in the house. So I'm assuming they mean the King Road residence, the house that was hit. There wasn't drug paraphernalia found. And while the complete autopsy reports on the 4 victims have not been released, there has been no claim that drugs were found in any of them at the time of their death. So again, we don't know if the girls had drugs in their system or not, according to official records, because the autopsy report hasn't shown whether or not they did toxicology reports and whether or not they were, I'm sure they did toxicology to determine how hammered they were, how drunk they really were, and whether or not they were on drugs. And by the way, if they were on drugs, and not me being a cynic, there's going to be an attempt to not bring out the fact that they were on illegal drugs. Because again, it's going to be important for the prosecution to make the jury view these girls and Ethan Chapin as innocent little lambs who were slaughtered for no reason. And so if you start making that into a question that they were doing drugs that night, that won't look so good. So I wouldn't be surprised if they did have any toxicology reports that indicated hardcore drugs in their systems, that there will be attempts to hide that from the jury because we need to have them look like innocent lambs. And again, I'm not saying that they deserve to die at all. I'm just saying that these are the games that people play. They don't want a jury going, well, you know, they were doing drugs that night and they were into drugs and they had a drug dealer in their door. Maybe it was a drug hit. They don't want to go down that route. So now we're going to talk about the jury and why the trial was moved in relation to police corruption. This gets super interesting to me again, because I focus on police corruption. We're at 37 minutes. I thought I was going to be done in about 35. I was wrong, because I think we have a whole nother chapter to cover. All right. The jury in a heartland community such as Moscow, the predilection for Old Testament eye for eye justice would, the defense presume, rule. Despite the many deficiencies in the narrative, they feared the prosecution would nevertheless not need to work too hard to spin a scenario that would send Koberger to death row, because it's got a heavy religious population. They're Kirkers, as we talked about earlier in this book. Or at least that's what they thought until they began weighing the disproportionate influence that Doug Wilson's Christ Church parishioners, with the Kirkers, had on the jury pool. About 2,000 or so strong, the Kirkers, as the church members called themselves, amounted perhaps to half of the town's non-university affiliated jury pool. And here's what left the defense team's hopes surging. The church, as personified by Wilson, was in a state of war with the town's authorities, including the police department, whose investigation had built the case against Koberger. So the church members, on the one hand, might be more inclined to convict and give the death penalty to a murderer who's into drugs and is just a horrible human being because he needs Jesus. So that's what they're suggesting. Hey, they could have it good because it's a religious community. A lot of religious people are going to be on that jury, and religious people are not going to have any sympathy for a drug user. Burn in hell. So that's what they think is going to hope. But their problem with that is that the church is at war or at odds with the police department. They view the police as being corrupt. Just days before Koberger's arrest, Wilson, this is the church leader, had shared his prickly feelings about the town's fathers in one of the weekly encyclicals that he sent to his flock. I know a lot of these words. Why am I stumbling on this? Anyways, our local city government, law enforcement included, is a nest of incompetence and corruption, he told his church members. So he believes that the cops are corrupt. In part, this is stemming over freaking COVID measures in which people were given citations for not wearing COVID masks during a church thing. But anyways, the point being is, there's a feud between the church and police where they consider the police to be corrupt and doing underhanded things. If a Moscow cop were to testify against Koberger, Wilson, this is the church leader, he had warned his parishioners. I can't get the sentence. If a Moscow cop were to testify against Koberger, he has warned his parishioners would have reason to be skeptical. After all, we know their officers have lied on the stand before, he explained, referring to cases involving his son and grandsons over the COVID thing. So in other words, what bottom line is the church leader is telling his parishioners, don't trust law enforcement in this town. They lie. They lie on the stand. If they lie in a COVID case, why would they not lie in a murder case? And so he's already laying the groundwork. I'm not sure you can trust law enforcement in this town. They're corrupt. They lie on the stand. So they're going to lie on the stand against Brian Koberger as well. And Wilson did not flinch from making his way to what was now the bottom legal line of the Moscow murders. From what I've read, he said, there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered. I think it's very possible the prosecution has the wrong man. So the church leader who's influencing his church parishioners saying, I think maybe they got the wrong guy and law enforcement will lie on the stand. I was wrong. We didn't have a second chapter. We are at the end and we're at 40 minutes. So I almost made it a time. So there you go. The drug angle touched upon. And let me back again. I've already hung myself in this episode lots of times by telling you get to beat the shit out of me and tell me that I know nothing about drugs and I should shut the hell up when it comes to drugs. And that's great. I do recommend if again, you probably already are. If you're not, and you're really big into the drug angle, one person I know for sure who is hyper focused on the drug angle is Pavarotti, Jay Embry. And I think you should watch, if you all, most of you are. In fact, if you know me, you probably came to me because you watched Pavarotti already. But if you're not, and you want to explore the drug angle much more deeply, Pavarotti is your man. I may get more into the drug angle as we go into trial, but I'm probably going to keep, I don't know that we're going to get another drop that's going to convince me to go balls deep, if you will, on the drug angle before trial. But if it comes up in trial, I will resurface this stuff, and we'll talk about it. So that ends now section 5 of this book. The very, very last section we have to deal with is part 6, Steve's story. One whole chapter. Epilogue, we're done. I anticipate the very next chapter that we do, the next video that we do in the Idaho 4 series, will end this series. We will be done. We will take a short breather, perhaps, as we prepare for James Patterson, his new book on the Idaho 4 coming out in a couple weeks in July. Okay, a few weeks in July. Yeah, a couple weeks in July. Also, there's a documentary, also supported by James Patterson as one of the producers of that documentary on the Idaho 4 that's coming out on Prime. So we're going to probably take a short respite after this next chapter, next week. In fact, it won't look like much of it. Now that I'm thinking about it, next week I'm going to cut the video for the last chapters. That's going to put us a week into July. So maybe a week after that, Patterson's book and the documentary comes out. But anyways, have a good one. Thanks for listening to my rants. Please be a little kind in the comments. I realize I've opened myself up to get kicked in the teeth about my comments and my feelings about drugs. I am not heavy into the drug community. I don't have a lot of drug friends. I never got big into drugs. I grew up in the era of don't do drugs, Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan era, don't do drugs, and the war on drugs bullshit, which I think is bullshit. I have feelings about drugs, but I don't do drugs. I'm not promoting drugs, and therefore I'm probably ignorant of the drug world, and a lot of you will come out here to educate me. Just be kind when you do so. I don't mind criticism. Just be kind. Have a good day.